Am. It's probably the most iconic brands we've gotten to witness. Most millennials and Gen Z have probably never heard of it because it shut down in 1991. But it once dominated the international airline industry. It was everywhere and very hard to miss. Now, if this name sounds familiar to you, it's probably because it's in the popular film Catch Me If You Can. Or at least that's what I think of when I hear Pan Am. The company that Frank becomes the pilot of is Pan Am. All the portrayal of glitz and glamour is hard to miss. Not only this, but the company also pioneered many innovations in the airline industry. From a company that was once a near monopoly in the airline industry and was so well loved by everyone, to a failing remnant in the back of our brains, how did Pan Am get here? Today we will talk about the tragic fall of Pan Am. Pan Am was founded by two former U.S. Army Air Corps majors in 1927. Initially, it began as a small airmail service between Key West, Florida and Havana, Cuba. But it did not take long to grow. Within a year, it was the United States' first scheduled international flight. You'll see a lot of firsts with Pan Am. It pioneered a lot of engineering. In the 1930s, American entrepreneur Juan Trippe took over the leadership, and things only improved for the company. The company introduced its first passenger service during this time. What was their strategy to attract passengers, you may ask? You see, during this time, there was alcohol prohibition in the US, so they advertised by encouraging people to fly to Havana so they could enjoy the sun and all the alcohol in the world without having to worry about any prohibition. During this time, air travel was a luxury and top-notch service was expected. Pan Am delivered this quite well. As most of Pan Am's fleet were flying boats, the pilots wore sea captains' uniforms. This decision still influences the uniforms of pilots today. Not only this, but as soon as Juan Trippe took over, he started appointing pilots for routes in the Caribbean. These scouted routes by the Pan Am became the basis for other aircraft. Pan Am also contributed to a lot of innovation and development in things like air traffic control, weather forecasting, routes, and flight procedures. When I say Pan Am has made a huge contribution to the development of the aviation industry, I'm not exaggerating. The company continued expanding its routes, and by 1935, it became the first to fly across the Pacific to China. This was seen as an exciting feat by everyone in the airline industry. By the mid-20th century, the airline company had a near monopoly on international routes. By 1958, Pan Am offered flights to every continent besides Antarctica, and it provided the flights regularly. Because of this, it gave itself the title of the world's most experienced airline, and it rightfully deserved the title. Not only that, but it had acquired some modern planes that allowed it to fly longer with large numbers of passengers and longer routes. This gave the company a huge competitive advantage. The rivals were far behind in terms of the service they provided to their passengers. The passengers loved everything the airline had to offer. The airplanes flew smoothly over the turbulent weather. The seats were super comfortable. The cabin crew knew what they were doing. And on top of it, the meals cannot be missed. The airline served luxurious meals like caviar, steak, and champagne. A real experience. If you think about it, in those times, every flying experience was better than what we have today. Good old days. Gotta love them. But even when all the flying experience was really good, Pan Am was better. The passengers flocked to the airline. It had now become a cultural icon. In 1970, Pan Am flew 11 million passengers to 86 countries worldwide. Mind you, these were the times when most of the airlines were wholly or majorly owned by the government. In times like these, Pan Am, a private company, became a sort of unofficial national carrier of the United States. Along with this, it was also the founding member of the International Air Transport Association, IATA, which is the global airline industry association. The company seemed unstoppable. They were dominating the airline market, but trouble was on its way, and they would face so much of it that the company would have no option but to shut down. The real trouble for the company started in October 1973, when the Arab nations, which provided most of the world with petroleum products, declared an oil embargo against various countries, including the US. The ban ended in March of 1974, and the oil price had risen by more than 400%. Now, this means the cost drastically increased for the company. Before the fuel was the issue, the company had purchased a Boeing 747. That was the right choice at the time, but after the crisis, not so much. The oil crisis not only affected businesses, but increased their costs. It affected the consumers too. People just did not have money to travel anymore. There were times when the planes were flying at half the capacity. This impacted the company financially. The company lost about $364 million, and was in around $1 billion in debt. Pan Am was all about international flights, but because of the crisis and the huge financial loss, the company decided that it was time to venture into the domestic market. This would have been the right decision, but the circumstances were not in its favor. The company tried to negotiate with various domestic operators, and they were all against the idea of Pan Am venturing into the domestic market. Pan Am was already dominating the international flight market, and giving it access to the domestic market meant there was a chance of it monopolizing the domestic market too. The other airline companies did not want that. So instead of supporting Pan Am, the companies convinced the US Congress that Pan Am would establish a domestic monopoly. Because of this reason, the Civil Aeronautics Board continuously denied Pan Am permission to operate in the domestic market. But things would change, and this would not last. In 1978, the Airline Deregulation Act was passed, which meant that the government had no control over the airline industry, especially the routes they covered, meaning Pan Am was free to join the domestic market. Instead of building from scratch, the company decided to purchase an already existing airline to enter into the domestic market. This should have worked out for the company, right? But it did not. Pan Am's takeover of the national airline was described as the coup of the decade. Pan Am had to go through a bidding war with Frank Lorenzo's Texas International to acquire the airline. Pan Am won the bid and acquired the company for $437 million. Here's the thing, the company was already financially strained because of the loss caused by the oil embargo. If this failed, it would put the company in more financial stress. And unfortunately, that's what ended up happening. The very different cultures of the two airlines crashed, and the management was poor. Just within the year of acquisition, Pan Am lost $18.9 million. It was not like the revenue did not increase. The revenue increased by 69% in 1 year, but fuel costs from the acquisition also increased by 157%, and their other expenses increased by 74%. This can be blamed on the weak economic conditions of the time. The situation had gotten so bad that the company had no other option but to start liquidating their assets to cover all the loss the company was bearing left and right. The company even had to sell off its iconic Pan Am building for $400 million. All this did not deter the reputation of the company. It was still considered one of the best airlines in the world, but more trouble would soon follow, and this would be the final nail in the coffin for the demise of the company. On the 21st of December 1988, a terrorist attack shook the world, but Pan Am became its biggest victim. A bomb was placed on Flight 103, which took off from Heathrow Airport bound for New York.
Carnage tonight in the Scotland village of Lockerbie, where a Pan Am 747 headed for New York crashed and exploded. No known survivors on the plane. They're still trying to determine the number of casualties on the ground.
It was never meant to touch down or land anywhere near Scotland, but the bomb that had been placed on the plane blew up while the plane was over a small town in Scotland. The blast killed all 259 people aboard. It did not spare the people of the small town as well, and the town had 11 fatalities of their own. Now, this attack cannot be fully blamed on Pan Am, as security measures back then were not as good and as strict as they are now. The airline followed the standardized security measures of that time perfectly, but it was not enough. The terrorists were able to get the bomb on board. Pan Am was held liable for being negligent. It again became the victim of their circumstance. This incident was beyond their control, and they had to pay for it, which was a hefty amount. Mind you, by this time, the company was already suffering financially. This bombing cost Pan Am more than $350 million, and as I said before, this was like the final nail in the coffin. There was no way that the company could come back from this, and on January 8, 1991, unable to sustain itself, the company finally filed for bankruptcy.
Unfortunately, we simply did not have the financial strength to absorb the enormously adverse impact of these external events.
By this time, no one could say they did not see this coming. It was a long time coming. By this time, the company had suffered financially for almost 2 decades. A bidding war took place, which Delta Airlines won, and it purchased the majority of Pan Am for $1.4 billion. Delta saw that there was no way they could revive this legendary company, and the decision was made to shut down the company. In this way, one of the most iconic companies to have ever existed in the aviation industry was gone forever. While more bankruptcies these days can be attributed to poor financial management and the companies themselves are to blame for it, the same cannot be said for Pan Am. Pan Am was a true victim of its circumstance. It tried doing everything right in its power, but one disaster after another struck, and they really had no option than to give up in the end. It was a big loss to the aviation industry, and its loss can be felt to this day. Employees and customers alike think of their time with Pan Am with great fondness, and we cannot help but wonder about all the innovation and development that the aviation industry would have seen if Pan Am would have still been around. I hope you enjoyed today's episode, and stay tuned for next week's adventure. Intellectual Digest out.